I'm Bill Hettinger, and I wanted to use this video to discuss a little bit about Hofstede's concepts of power distance. I'm going to use three examples in this video to demonstrate how power distance works in different societies. So the concept of power distance is how far do you feel you are from the people in power, and how willing are you to override the people in power? And we have societies such as the United States that are low power distance, where people feel they're very close to power. And we have societies, many other hierarchical societies, long-term societies, where there's a very hierarchical structure and people feel very much that they're far from the seats of power. I'm going to start this example with Barack Obama. As you know, as I record this video, Barack Obama is President of the United States. I will contend that Barack Obama is also, in many societies, a very unlikely person to be the leader of a country, and yet in the United States, that's fully possible. So the president before Barack Obama was George W. Bush. George W. Bush's father, George H.W. Bush, was also president of the United States. George H.W. Bush's father, Prescott Bush, was an ambassador and a United States senator. So from the Bush's perspective, they come from a family that had a history of being active in politics and rising to very powerful positions within the government and within society. Barack Obama, on the other hand, as he describes himself in his biography, is the son of a white woman from Kansas and a black man from Kenya. He's born in Hawaii very soon after the father leaves, so he's raised by a single mother. He's raised primarily in Indonesia as a young boy, where he's basically a Jakarta street kid running around the streets of Jakarta while his mother's working on her nonprofit activities. He at some point moves to Hawaii, where he's raised by his grandparents. His grandparents have somewhat of a middle-class existence. His grandmother is a bank vice president in Hawaii, so he's moved from a Jakarta street kid to a middle-class kid in Hawaii. Again, Hawaii is not famous for generating presidents. He graduates from high school and he enrolls in Occidental College in Los Angeles. Again, Occidental College is not famous for generating presidents. It's not Yale or Harvard, and all our presidents seem to come from Yale or Harvard. He then is smart. He's able to transfer to Columbia. He earns his degree from Columbia. Columbia is a good school. It's an Ivy League school. It sort of has that moneyed reputation that many of the other schools don't have. He graduates from Columbia, takes a job that he hates as a financial analyst for sort of a financial services bureau. He doesn't stay there very long. He doesn't like it. Again, it isn't on a path to the presidency, and it's sort of in a low, very low on the power totem pole. He goes to Chicago, where he becomes a community organizer, works with nonprofit groups, works on social issues. He leaves that and goes to Harvard Law School. So now he's at Harvard, where we start to produce presidents. No one's told him he can't go to Harvard. He's smart. He gets into Harvard. He does very well at Harvard. He becomes a law professor. He becomes an Illinois state senator. He gives a fantastic speech at one of the Democratic events. He parlays that into the United States Senate, which he then parlays into the presidency. The point with Barack Obama is he didn't have to come from royalty like the Bush family or like the Roosevelt family or any other powerful families in the United States. He simply could rise to be president, starting off his life basically as a Jakarta street kid. Now I'm going to use a second example here, and this is of a Columbian Airlines flight. This story takes place in the early 1970s, and I'm taking this information from Malcolm Gladwell's book, Outliers. I love Malcolm Gladwell's a great storyteller, and I'll paraphrase the story from his book. The Columbian Airlines flight was coming from Columbia to the United States. It was going to land at JFK Airport. We had weather up and down the United States that night. All the airports on the East Coast were stuck with rain and fog. It's very difficult to get planes in and out. So the plane comes into the United States, and the air traffic controls makes it go into its first holding pattern over North Carolina. So the plane is in a holding pattern over North Carolina. It's circling around. Air traffic control says, "How's it going?" And the flight crew says, "It's going good. We're running a little bit low on fuel." An hour goes by. They're brought up to another holding pattern this time over Maryland and Delaware. They're put in this holding pattern for about half an hour. Air traffic control says, "How's it going?" The flight crew says, "Well, good, but we're running a little bit low on fuel." They're released from that holding pattern. They're brought into the final holding pattern over JFK Airport, New York. "How's it going?" "It's going fine. We're running out of fuel." The plane is allowed to approach the airport. It comes in on final approach. It's raining. It's foggy. The plane overshoots the runway. The plane basically was not able to land. So they take the plane back off. The pilots do a very good job. They take the plane back off and they head out to eastern Long Island, where they're put into another holding pattern. This is their fourth holding pattern. Air traffic control asks, "How's it going?" The co-pilot replies, "Well, we're running a little bit low on fuel." Now, what happens at this point is the stewardess comes into the cockpit. Now, in these days, the flight crew, there were three members of the flight crew. There was a pilot, co-pilot, and a navigator. The stewardess comes into the cockpit and sees not that they're running a little bit low on fuel, but that the fuel warning lights on the dashboard are flashing. The lights are flashing, indicating we're about to run out of fuel. She gets bright-eyed. She looks at the navigator. The navigator goes like this and sort of slices his throat, indicating we're all dead. The plane, now running very low on fuel, very dangerously low on fuel, is finally given the chance again to approach Kennedy Airport. So the plane gets within a couple hundred yards of Kennedy Airport and crashes. 158 people are killed. There are some survivors, including the stewardess, whose story I've just relayed, which is why we're able to relay this story. And it takes 1 day to figure out why the plane crashed. The basic answer is it ran out of fuel. Now, the autopsy on this, we did a little study of how could you allow a plane to run out of fuel? And the answer really comes out to be power distance. The answer for the autopsy was an American never would have stood for that. If you think of the scenario, it's a Columbian pilot, it's a Columbian flight crew, it's a Columbian co-pilot. Columbia is a relatively high power distance society, which means the Colombians have a very high respect for those in authority and tend to defer to those in authority. If you picture the air traffic controller from New York, you have a very busy, gruff New York air traffic controller trying to manage many, many planes in the air because all flights are delayed all over the place. He's got a very, very busy job that night in New York. He's very gruff, he's very direct. And anyone who's ever met a very gruff, very direct New Yorker knows that they can be intimidating. So we have this hierarchical society that respects authority, respects power, and we have a very gruff, powerful air traffic controller giving instructions. Now, the concept of an American never would have stood for that. Well, you're probably thinking, what would you do? Well, what an American would have done is most likely say, as the lights were flashing on the control panel of the plane, saying, "I'm not interested in remaining in your holding pattern anymore. I'm landing the plane now. I don't care that you told me I can't. I'm going to land the plane right now." And the American at that point would have flipped the power distance relationship, and instead of deferring to the gruff New York air traffic controller, would have simply said, "I'm landing the plane, deal with it." And the American probably would have landed the plane safely, assuming they hit the approach the second time to the airport right. The Colombians, because they are very high power distance, politely ran out of gas and crashed the plane, and 158 people died. Now, we have a similar story in Gladwell's book, and I'll paraphrase this one very quickly, but it concerns a South Korean Airlines flight flying to Guam. And what happened on this particular flight was the pilot was a very respected elder pilot for the airlines. The co-pilot makes all decisions in deference to the pilot. The pilot was also tired. Ideally, the pilot probably should not have been flying. He should have been home taking a nap or something. And the plane politely flew into a mountain while approaching Guam. Now, what happened was the pilot was too tired to fly the plane, but because of his position, he felt it was his obligation to fly the plane rather than defer to the co-pilot. The co-pilot, who knew they were going to fly into the mountain, was deferring to the pilot because he was the respected pilot, and they politely flew into a mountain, and everyone on the plane died. And again, the autopsy indicated that this was a power distance problem. The co-pilot was not willing to override the pilot. and take command of that aircraft, even though it meant certain death. Again, an American would have taken over the plane, and we'll settle it later. The final example of this is, I want to use the Sully Sullenberger example, where he landed the U.S. Airways plane on the Hudson River about 2009 or so. And the example on this is Sullenberger takes off with his plane from LaGuardia Airport. He gets up in the air for about 2 minutes. He hits a flock of birds, which basically destroy both engines of the plane. He gets on communication with air traffic control, who tells him to, same gruff New York air traffic control people, who tells him to return to LaGuardia Airport. He starts to attempt to return to LaGuardia Airport, realizes he's not going to make it. He then looks over to his left and he sees Teterboro Airport, which is sort of a small private plane airport in New Jersey. He asks whether he can land there. They indicate, well, we can try to clear the runways for you. He gets back on and says, nope, I'm not going to make that either. And he announces to air traffic control that I am now going to land his plane on the Hudson River. The point with that story, and again, if you listen to the transcripts of that as I've done on several occasions in preparation for this video and preparation for this story, you hear him flip the relationship. Air traffic control says, return to LaGuardia. No can do. Land at Teterboro. No can do. He flips the relationship, and he now becomes the power person and is willing to land the plane. In his scenario, he actually was successful. Everyone on the plane survived. The concept of power distance is how willing are you, how able are you to flip the distance, to flip the switch between those in power and yourself. In the case of these airline examples, Sullenberger was able to do it. Others are able to simply take over. Obama's able to do it. The crew of the Columbian Airlines flight, the crew of the South Korean airline flight should have done it. They should have simply taken it over and deferred the respect for authority. But because of their culture and the great power distance in their culture, they didn't feel comfortable doing that. Whereas a low power distance society, you simply flip the switch and take over the point of power. The interesting part, I think, in the Sullenberger story is, as soon as he flipped the switch and said, this is what I'm doing, air traffic control then deferred to him. They immediately recognized the transfer of power. In the South Korean example, if the pilot had taken over, if the co-pilot had taken over, the culture was such that he probably would be in trouble even if the people had survived. The Colombian pilot might be in trouble even if the people had survived, or at least he perceived it as such. Now, they've since changed those airplane procedures so that doesn't happen anymore. But that's the concept of power distance. Can you flip the switch? Do you believe the person in power, or at some point are you willing simply to override?